mean, I think if you go through my studio, I think things radically change every day. So if you'd been here 3 weeks ago, or if you'd been here 2 days ago, it would be entirely different. So things get, I think, reworked pretty quickly and pretty radically, and things get sometimes left and then reworked on again. Yeah, I usually have working on like several things all at the same time. So focus very, for like 3 days on one thing, and then get it to a point, and then move away from it, get some distance, and work on something else. But it changes. I even forget how radically it changes, and people come in, and they, to me that seems like a normal process. I think the only reason I realize it changes that much is from other people coming in. And I think it's like that on site too. I would say that that's the one thing that people emphasize the most about working with me on site, is the radical amount of change that happens every day up until the last minute. I see my work as sculpture because I think sculpture is when you deal with objects. We start with objects as the point of reference. In my work, I think of the relationship between objects and how that creates meaning. So, when you enter a work of mine, I want you to not only deal with the objects, deal with the space, deal with the experience, be immersed, but really what it is the object is the magnet that creates that experience, draws you in. And I think in many ways what I'm trying to do is really disperse that object, break it down, dislocate you within an object, so that when you walk in, you focus on one object, but immediately you have to move to another, you have to move to another, so that you have choices. And in many ways, I think this is about the way you see. When you come into this room, you see a ladder, but it relates to the window, it relates to the building. It's very quick. You can't isolate an object. So I think a traditional idea of sculpture is that you have an isolated object. So the piece in Venice, the title is Triple Point. It's an example of this idea of trying to sit between many things at once. And a triple point comes from this term, the triple point, for example, of water. It's where a substance exists in 3 states at once. So with water, it would be ice, melting, and then having a vapor at the same time. So it's in 3 states at once. So I think in some ways, and the reason I chose that title is because in some ways I'm interested in creating a situation where you're sitting between many, many different directions. So my choice of material, I think starts with scale. A lot of the way I want you to approach a sculpture of mine is to think about how it relates to your body, how it relates to your hand, how it relates to your mouth, how you imagine it or remember it in relation to a real experience with an object. So I start with objects usually that have that relationship to the body. I think of my materials as a palette that get edited out or brought in depending on things that are relevant to me in any particular sculpture. I think, for example, something that might be relevant is the idea that a sculpture is constantly growing and dying at the same time, that it's being in a process of construction, but at the same time a process of deconstruction, so that when you come to a sculpture, it's teetering at that point, and you imagine its creation and you imagine its destruction. So it's right at this point of you don't know which direction it's going to go. So for example, some of the objects will actually play on that. So you'll have materials that talk about construction and materials that will inevitably erode. So that could mean leaving a ladder in, that can mean having a live plant, so that you imagine that there's a kind of ecosystem that is both in development and in demise. But the objects, the choice of the objects, I think is a lot about the idea of intimacy and lack of familiarity, and this teetering. So I want them to be objects that are familiar to you. They look so mundane that they actually have really no value at all, so that they can be, and value in this way, determined by easily accessible, mass-produced, easily replaced. let's say that that's because you could define value in many ways, but so mostly they often have a very throwaway quality to them, because I'm interested in taking something that's so valueless, that's so ubiquitous, so familiar that it has no meaning anymore, and then suddenly putting it in a location or in proximity to other things where it seems like it actually has an incredible amount of value by the way it's been treated, by the way it's been placed, by the way you approach it. So, this idea of creating a kind of strangely intimate experience with a work of art in a very public space, that challenge of how do you create intimacy in a space that is completely public. In Venice, for example, I really wanted the building to be much more, you usually walk in, it's a complete hierarchy. It's a very rigorous hierarchy. You walk in the center door, and on either end, you go left, you go right. And I wanted to change that. I wanted to make it a string of experiences where you were constantly oriented and disoriented in the space. So you entered to the left, and when you entered to the left, the first piece was a very iconic piece, and the door shut behind you, and you're completely sucked into a very central piece because the piece was round. It was like a planetarium. When you went to the second room, the piece is divided in half, and your body was actually in this negative space in the room. And when you turned, then you had this long view, and 2 rooms down, there was a pendulum, which if you focused out of the peripheral eyesight, you could see a kind of movement, and there was actually a framed poster of the sky from very far away. So I'm thinking about how it's a very filmic idea, because anyone who's ever done any kind of editing in film knows that entirely the meaning comes out of the editing. That when it's the juxtaposition, it's that space in between the two the cut itself that creates meaning. So for me, that's what I'm thinking a lot. It goes back to your question of installation, sculpture. For me, the meaning is always happening between the transition between things, not the things themselves. The American Pavilion is tough because it has, for many reasons, but it has an outside courtyard, so it kind of demands an outdoor piece. And I really wanted to play with that idea that when you first came to the building, there was a piece that had a significant presence on the outside of the building, but you didn't entirely understand it until you had made the full route through the building. And there are 2 reasons why you don't understand it. One is that each of the works in the space is kind of a mechanism. It plays on the idea of traditional mechanisms to try and understand where we are in time and space, whether it's a compass, a pendulum, a planetarium, this idea of how do we measure time and space and how complicated that idea really is in literal and in metaphorical ways. So the outside piece is actually a weather vane, but you don't really understand that. You sort of see it, it feels very chaotic, and you understand that it goes up one side of the building, and it's sort of like a kind of hovel that covers something, but you don't really understand it. That it's very important that everything was off center in the building to me, because the building it became an American idea that was stolen from Palladio, which Palladio was like very, making the Villa Rotunda, half an hour away from the Giardini. And Palladio was borrowed by the Americans, by Thomas Jefferson. The White House is based on it. University of Virginia is based on it. This very traditional idea of when you walk in, it's really a Renaissance idea. You walk in, and in the most traditional Palladian building, there's literally a compass on the floor. And with the Villa Rotunda, which is the classic, you see northeast, southwest. You are the center of the earth. The idea for inside and outside really becomes apparent when you actually go through this string of experiences and you come to the last room. I really wanted to make that room about an interior space that felt exterior, And then when you get there, you realize that the outdoor piece is actually sort of shielding an exterior space that then feels interior. And you're in this kind of balance between those two spaces. And they melt the building in a kind of way. So the first thing I did was I actually put mirrors to continue that view, which is this very horizontal view of seeing, which is actually interesting because it's related to the architecture of that time. In the 70s, you know, like in the States, Frank Lloyd Wright was very big, so it's all about the horizon, the landscape. And so when you walk into that room, you actually, your view circulates out. To me, it's also very interesting that when you go to see a show, that you actually feel like you're in the studio. It was important to me that the pavilion had the rawness of like a laboratory or a studio of something where still things were going to happen. So that room was really interesting because it actually, everything in the room was a process that was just stopped, but it was an actual process of sort of a system to make work that then became the work itself in that room. I think a piece is finished when it can sit between many things at once. And I think, you know, that's the last stage of a show or of a work. You know, and usually it's, much of it has built to a location, and you can change things. Again, this is like, you know, I think in writing and editing, and this is, I mean, we learned to write. Everyone knows how to write. So I use those metaphors a lot about when people ask about process in art. You know, when you're writing, when you've written an essay, or a poem, or a novel, you take the last chapter in the novel, you put it in the front, and everything can change, right? So you're at a location where, I mean, I think the work develops to the point where you're at a location where you see the balance and you decide what that balance is. And you don't always get it right, but when it feels like, for me, when it feels like you walk into a work of art and every time you try and decide what's happening, it flips. And then it flips, and then it flips, and it flips.